Okay, hi everyone. We're going to be moving on to chapter 9 today, and it's important to note a couple of things before we even get into the summary of the narrative of chapter 9. First and foremost, the beginning of chapter 9, we should try and picture Utterson at home after having just left the house where he's found the body of Hyde sorely contorted and still twitching, and he's now opening the sealed envelopes that have been given to him by Lanyon and that he's found on Jekyll or in Jekyll's house. So these envelopes are only to be opened after the death or disappearance of Dr. Jekyll. So he opens this envelope, and the first one he reads is Dr. Lanyon's narrative. Remember, this is part of the epistolary narrative. Epistolary meaning that there are lots of different documents that combine to create the story. In this case, we have the letter written by Lanyon. So he sits down and he begins to read this letter, and it's a first-person account from Dr. Lanyon's perspective. And the important thing to note is obviously Dr. Lanyon dies at the end of chapter 6. So this letter is written before his death, and actually the letter helps explain why he dies. Now, he describes in chapter 6 that he has had a shock from which he shall never recover, and this letter explains what that shock is all about, okay, and explains what happens. So it's important you know this before even looking at the chapter, that the chapter is in first-person narrative, okay, that it's written from Dr. Lanyon's perspective, and that essentially it tells us the reason for his death, okay? So now into the chapter itself. Now the chapter begins by basically explaining that he received a letter. So Dr. Lanyon says, I received a letter. And what confuses things even further is that Dr. Lanyon actually writes in his letter the full letter from Henry Jekyll. So it can be quite difficult if you haven't been told this, that essentially the beginning of the chapter is in Dr. Lanyon's first person account, but then he moves on in the letter from Jekyll to write in Jekyll's first person account because it's a letter from Jekyll. Now the letter itself is quite complicated, but in essence it says, can you go to my house? This is Jekyll speaking to Lanyon. And can you get certain things from a drawer, take the drawer and bring it back to your home? This drawer contains lots of chemicals and compounds that he needs for a potion. Now, Lanyon gets this letter, he reads it, and one of the first key quotes on page 37 here is, I made sure my colleague was insane, but till that was proved beyond the possibility of doubt, I felt bound to do as he requested. So Lanyon basically says, this whole letter from Jekyll was crazy, it was insane, but I felt that I had to do what he had asked me until I could prove otherwise. Now, this is good evidence of Lanyon's scientific procedure, that he follows the rules and regulations of scientific practice in order to come to a conclusion. And he does so by following the kind of suggestions from Henry Jekyll here about what he needs to do. Then we have how he goes about doing what he's been asked to do. So he goes to Jekyll's house, he speaks to Poole. Basically, they get a locksmith to open a door, and beyond this door they find a little kind of mini cabinet laboratory, and they pull out a drawer, and in that drawer it has lots of different chemicals. He specifically does something when he returns to his home which highlights how dangerous he feels the situation is. So this is another key quote, a very short one, page 38. It says, I loaded an old revolver that I might be found in some posture of self-defence. So after having been instructed to go to Jekyll's home, picking up the drawer, taking it back to Lanyon's own home, Lanyon is so afraid of what comes next that he decides to keep a loaded revolver beside him in anticipation of who might come to the door. Now he's sitting waiting on the arrival of someone. That person happens to be Mr. Hyde, who comes into his home. Now remember, Lanyon has never seen Mr. Hyde, doesn't know anything about him, so he doesn't recognise Hyde when he comes in the house. So Hyde comes into the home, and Hyde speaks to him and asks him for the potion, and basically in front of Lanyon he creates this kind of concoction with all these chemicals, and he creates a potion. And he says to Lanyon, okay, at this stage you have two options. You can either say to me, stay, and you can witness what this potion will do if you're curious, or you can ignore this and say for me to leave, and we can forget this ever happened, and you won't know what the reason for all this planning was. And Lanyon basically says, I've came this far, I want you to do it. I want to see what happens with this potion. So Hyde kind of speaks to Lanyon and says, well, okay, you who said this couldn't happen, you who didn't believe in this type of science, You who'd called it scientific heresy, watch and behold what I am capable of. And he takes the potion. Okay, so this is it's Hyde speaking, but you can hear Jekyll's voice behind Hyde basically saying, you didn't believe me, watch what happens next. So he takes the potion, and then what happens is interesting. Page 40, I could hear his teeth grate with the convulsing action of his jaws. And that's basically him starting to change and starting to alter. And you start to see things that change. And just before Jekyll actually is transformed into Jekyll from Hyde, he says to Lanyon, remember your vows, what follows is under the seal of our profession. So he basically says to Lanyon, what you're about to see, you cannot tell anyone. And he knows that Lanyon will stay to his professional rules and expectations. He won't tell anyone what's about to happen. Now the change happens and there's this convulsion and transformation in front of him. And Lanyon sees this horrible transformation happen in front of his eyes. And he says, oh God, I screamed. And oh God, again and again. And you could argue this is Lanyon kind of calling on a protective power from his maker, from God, because he's seeing something truly unnatural happen before him. He's seeing essentially Hyde and Jekyll play God by transforming their body from one thing to another, which can't be done. Then there's a great little simile here. Like a man restored from death, there stood Henry Jekyll. And that further helps to exemplify this idea of Jekyll playing God. Only God can restore someone from death in religious ideas, in religious terms. So Jekyll has played God by restoring himself from death. Then Lanyon goes on to explain the fact that he'd seen this happen and that this is something that had impacted him mentally. And this gives us clear indication as to why Lanyon dies in chapter 6. He's essentially had a shock of the mind, a deep-seated terror of the mind, which unfortunately leads to his demise because he can't really reconcile his scientific beliefs with what he saw that night, and he ends up dying from shock, essentially. The last quotation in this chapter that's important is, the creature who crept into my house that night was, on Jekyll's own confession, the man wanted for the murder of Carew, Hyde. So he basically explains in this letter, in this statement to whoever's going to read it, which happens to be Utterson, that Jekyll and Hyde are the one and the same person. Now that's chapter 9. It gives us an idea of one of the big missing jigsaw pieces as to the whole story, and it's about Lanyon having found out that Hyde and Jekyll are one and the same, and it gives us a clear indication as to why Lanyon dies at the end of chapter 6. Essentially he died from shock. Okay, we'll move on to chapter 10, and we'll split chapter 10 into two videos because it's so long. So we're going to look at chapter 10a and chapter 10b in the next couple of weeks. Thanks.